passion at 8 years old. And anyone that can get a passion that early and really know what it is, and my passion was to make people happy.
That dream into music, into Motown, into the hundreds of artists he called family. He turned unknown voices into legends, transformed a small studio in Detroit into the capital of a new sound. And then one day, he looked back and realized the ones who made him most proud were also the ones who had hurt him the most. Not because they were bad, but because they left when he still loved them. Because they asked for what he could not give. Because they stayed silent when he needed to be understood. 7 people, unnamed, no need to call them back, left indelible marks on Berry Gordy's heart more quietly than any contract, more deeply than any song ever written. At the age of 95, when all glory has found its place on the shelf of remembrance, Berry Gordy is only beginning to speak of the things he once kept to himself. Not to condemn, but to remember, to understand, to forgive. So what happened between him and them? Why do those wounds still smolder to this day? Marvin Gaye and What's Going On. In 1970, America exploded in pains that had no name. Gunfire in Vietnam, protesters falling in the streets of America, soldiers returning home with vacant eyes. Amid all those wordless cries, Marvin Gaye, a naturally introspective and calm artist, began to feel that his music had become meaningless. The smooth love songs Motown favored no longer seemed capable of expressing a world falling apart. In the heavy silence of the times, Marvin turned to music as a form of prayer, and What's Going On was born a tender whisper to humanity. But when he handed that spiritual child to Berry Gordy, the godfather of the Motown empire, Marvin received only a cold rejection. "This is the worst record I've ever heard." That sentence Marvin never forgot. Berry Gordy didn't hate Marvin. That likely never happened. But he was afraid. Motown, built by Gordy from the ground up, symbolized joy color and the rise of Black Americans through lovable, non-controversial music. He once banned his singers from using the word baby in songs, fearing it might offend older audiences. So how could he accept a song that questioned war, the government, and even America's own identity? What's Going On was rejected. Not once, but for 7 long months. Marvin, once Motown's golden boy with I Heard It Through the Grapevine selling over 4 million copies, was now seen as stubborn. Gordy didn't stop Marvin from recording, but he absolutely refused to release the track. He said the song was too long, messy, lacking a catchy melody, and would flop commercially. Marvin didn't feel anger. He felt a quiet sadness, a fracture in the respect he once had for Gordy. A big brother he believed would understand the sorrow of a black man amidst the silent cries of the world. Marvin stayed silent, but he didn't back down. He told the label, if What's Going On wasn't released, he would no longer record. It seemed like just a bold statement, but Marvin truly vanished from the studio. He retreated into his inner world, living like a reclusive soldier armed with music waiting to be unleashed. Berry Gordy found himself in a bind. As a label executive, he couldn't let a top-selling star go inactive. But it wasn't easy to steer Motown into the murky waters of politics. Eventually, Gordy agreed to a test release. What's Going On debuted in early 1971. And then the miracle happened. Within weeks, the single climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart. The full album, released a few months later, not only became Marvin's masterpiece, but in 2020 was ranked the greatest album of all time by Rolling Stone. Berry Gordy, though initially reluctant, called its success a turning point in music. But some wounds once etched deep aren't healed even by pride. Marvin never truly got over it. To him, What's Going On wasn't just a song. It was a humanist question to a black world being choked by market molds. What are we doing, brothers? Marvin Gaye had opened the door. But the ones who would walk through that door would be even bolder. Artists who demanded justice not only through melody, but through creative control, financial freedom, and rightful recognition. They didn't just want to sing, they wanted to be paid what they were worth. And that leads us to the next chapter, when the 3 songwriting geniuses, Holland-Dozier-Holland, no longer wanted to write on hire for Berry Gordy, but stepped into an unprecedented legal battle in Motown history. Holland-Dozier-Holland. They never sang. They never stood on stage. and their names rarely appeared on the charts. But if Motown was a music empire, then Holland-Dozier-Holland HDH were the quiet architects who laid its foundation. In just 6 years, from 1962 to 1968, they wrote and produced over 200 songs, including 28 R&B #1 hits and 12 chart toppers on the Billboard Hot 100. Songs like Stop in the Name of Love, You Can't Hurry, Love Baby Love, and Reach Out, I'll Be There not only defined the Motown sound, but became part of modern American cultural heritage. And then they left. In silence, no shots fired, no angry farewell letter. They simply stopped turning in new music. An unofficial strike, as colleagues called it, broke out in the very heart of Motown, and it took Berry Gordy months to realize he was losing the greatest musical brain trust he had ever had. The story didn't start with rage. It started with numbers. When Motown exploded in the mid-1960s, HDH, made up of Brian Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Eddie Holland, were the ones working relentlessly behind the scenes. They wrote all day, arranged all night, and supervised recordings at dawn. They were responsible not just for the Supremes, but also for Four Top's Marvin Gaye, Martha, and the Vandellas, and many others. Yet when they looked at their paychecks, they realized they were receiving only a tiny percentage of the profits. Rates signed back when they were unknowns. Meanwhile, Motown was pulling in millions, and they were barely scraping by on royalties. Berry Gordy didn't underestimate the trio. On the contrary, he once called them the most efficient hit machine in the world. But he was also a disciplined businessman when it came to financial control. Gordy believed artists should be grateful to Motown for giving them a chance. HDH, on the other hand, felt they were no longer being valued. So they stopped writing. No noise, no warning, just no more songs. At first, Gordy thought they had run out of ideas. But then the artists began complaining. The songs were mediocre, lacking seductive melodies, missing the signature sparkle in their arrangements. Motown wobbled. That's when Berry realized this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate move. He responded the way a former boxer-turned-founder might. He sued. In 1968, Motown filed a lawsuit accusing HDH of breach of contract. But HDH didn't stand still. They countersued, demanding a fair share of profits from the hits they had written. The legal battle dragged on for nearly 4 years, not played out in the press, but tense behind the scenes. During that time, HDH left Motown and founded 2 of their own labels, Hot Wax and Invictus. They continued releasing hits like Band of Gold and Give Me Just a Little More Time. But the glory didn't last. Without Motown's ecosystem, without Gordy's sophisticated promotion machine, their output quickly lost ground. Conversely, Motown also struggled to recover. Despite emerging new talents, the soul in its music had clearly diminished. It wasn't until 1972 that the two sides settled out of court. HDH received an undisclosed sum. Motown retained ownership of the old songs. But the greatest loss wasn't money, it was trust. The relationship once praised as family could never be mended. Berry Gordy later said in an interview, "We didn't speak for years. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars we lost in those lawsuits. I only know the only winners were the lawyers." And when trust is replaced by contracts, when dedication is no longer fairly rewarded, can a musical family still survive as a true home? That was the question Berry Gordy had to face as he entered the next chapter of his life, where the first woman to take Motown to the top chose to leave him through yet another legal battle. Mary Wells. Mary Wells, the First Lady leaves, and the pain of parting. Before Diana Ross was known as the Queen of Motown, and even before Marvin Gaye became the voice of America's conscience, there was a young, charming woman with a voice both innocent and sharp who first led Motown into the spotlight. Mary Wells. At just 17 years old, she knocked on the door of Berry Gordy's fledgling label with a song she had written herself. Not long after, Mary became the First Lady of Motown with the legendary hit My Guy. In 1964, the track that brought Motown to the top of the Billboard Hot 100 for the first time. Berry Gordy once spoke of Mary with tender admiration. "She was the first star I didn't need to promote too hard. Just hand her the mic." But it was Mary Wells herself who became the first to publicly leave Motown while still at the height of her fame. She left quietly without fanfare, leaving behind a Berry Gordy who was angry, helpless, and as he admitted years later, very sad. That wound began with the cold numbers written in her contract. Mary Wells signed with Motown in 1960, still a teenager under 18. The contract was very basic. Motown retained all rights to publishing distribution and profits. The artist received a fixed fee plus a small royalty percentage. For an unknown, it was an opportunity. But by 1964, after a string of major hits, Mary started noticing the disparity. My Guy sold over 1 million copies within weeks, becoming a favorite of President Lyndon Johnson and even the Beatles. Yet Mary's pay hadn't changed much from the first year she stepped into Motown's small recording booth. She asked to renegotiate her contract. Gordy refused. She requested a larger share of the profits, also denied. But this time Mary Wells didn't stay silent. She and her lawyer found a clause that allowed contracts signed by minors to be voided. And they followed through. In 1964, Mary Wells sued Motown for legal emancipation at the height of her fame. Berry Gordy was stunned. He tried everything to keep her offered a raise, promised a solo album, even considered restructuring the deal to make her a partner. But Mary had made up her mind. She didn't just want more money, she wanted the right to control her own artistic future. In January 1965, Mary Wells won the case, becoming the first artist to break free from Motown while still on top. She immediately signed a $200,000 contract with 20th Century Fox Records, a sum many times larger than anything she had received from Motown. Gordy couldn't hide his disappointment. Motown lost its brightest female star. But deeper still, he lost a spiritual little sister, someone he once saw as the first national face of Motown. It's said that for a long time afterward, Gordy never mentioned Mary's name in strategic meetings. She became a quiet blank spot in Motown's memory. As for Mary, the departure didn't bring the outcome she'd hoped for. Despite a lucrative contract, 20th Century Fox lacked the expertise in soul music. Her follow-up album flopped. Then came a string of other labels, Atco, Jubilee, Reprise, none of which could restore her former glory. She struggled with illness, financial hardship, and most painfully was forgotten by the very industry she helped pioneer. In her final years, Mary Wells lived in poverty. When she developed throat cancer and lost her ability to sing, it was Berry Gordy and Motown who organized a fundraiser to help cover her medical expenses. When Mary died in 1992 at the age of 49, many said Motown wasn't there for her when she needed it most, and neither was she there for Motown. The tragic ending of a woman who once defined an entire musical era. But the story wasn't just a personal tragedy. It revealed a harsh truth that black female artists in the 1960s had virtually no voice against male-dominated music power structures. Mary Wells wasn't just fighting for a better contract, she was fighting to reclaim ownership of her voice. In an age when a young woman's singing could define a record label's identity, Mary had the courage to ask, "If I'm the soul of this music, why don't I own it?" She left to find that answer, and perhaps never did. But that wound opened the path for future artists to demand fairness and see beyond the stage lights. And Gordy, though he never said it outright, surely understood Mary's departure wasn't just a loss. It was the first wake-up call that Motown could not keep genius with loyalty alone. A lesson that would be repeated more bitterly, more publicly, with the next artist on the list, David Ruffin, the former lead voice of The Temptations, who wanted the whole world to say his name first. David Ruffin, When Ego Outgrows the Band. No one can deny that it was Ruffin with My Girl in 1965 who propelled The Temptations beyond the mold of a typical black vocal group and into the ranks of global icons. But it was also that same artist who just a few years later became an internal storm so disruptive that Berry Gordy had to choose between immense talent and the survival of the collective. If Marvin Gaye was the philosophical soul and Mary Wells the first sweet voice, then David Ruffin was the embodiment of the untameable artistic ego. And Motown, as sophisticated as it was, wasn't strong enough to contain someone both at the height of fame and spiraling into self-delusion. Ruffin joined The Temptations at the end of 1963, replacing Elbridge Bryant. It wasn't until 1964-65, when My Girl exploded, that he became the lead vocalist, with the press calling him the new soul of Motown. Berry Gordy admired Ruffin. He once described David as one of the greatest male voices I've ever heard. But along with that talent came a growing demand. David didn't want to be seen as a member of the group, he wanted to be its standout star. While touring with Diana Ross and the Supremes, Ruffin noticed Diana's name always came first on the posters, Diana Ross and the Supremes. He asked management, "Why not me? I'm the lead singer of The Temptations. I can take this group to the next level on my own." That moment marked the widening rift between Ruffin and the rest. He proposed renaming the group David Ruffin and the Temptations. Berry Gordy flatly refused. The tension didn't stop at the name. Ruffin demanded Motown open its financial records, allowing him and the other Temptations members to see the actual revenue from tours and records. He suspected the label was hiding profits. Gordy, a notoriously tight controller of finances, only allowed an independent auditor to review the numbers, not the artists themselves. To Ruffin, this was a sign that he was neither trusted nor respected. Feeling marginalized, David became reckless. He began missing performances, showing up late to rehearsals, getting involved with drugs, and making headlines for high-profile relationships, especially with singer Tammy Terrell, whom Marvin Gaye once heartbreakingly described as a fragile light inside a storm called Ruffin. The breaking point came during a concert in Cleveland, when Ruffin abandoned the show mid-set to attend a private party, leaving the group to cover for his absence on stage. For Berry Gordy, that was the last straw. He supported the Temptations' decision to officially fire David Ruffin, which happened on June 27, 1968. Within 24 hours, his replacement, Dennis Edwards, was announced, and the Temptations moved on, as if Ruffin had never been part of them. But David refused to exit quietly. He began crashing the group's shows, appearing unexpectedly, grabbing the mic, singing his old solos, and vanishing under the stage lights, thrilling the crowd and putting the band in an awkward position. Gordy had to hire security guards to prevent him from getting on stage. But the chaos continued for weeks. Soon after, Ruffin sued Motown to terminate his solo artist contract so he could sign with another label. Gordy countersued to enforce the existing contract. Eventually, they reached a settlement. Ruffin had to fulfill his Motown obligations before he could leave. He released several solo albums, achieving moderate success, but never regained the towering status he once held with the Temptations. Yet this story was merely a prelude to a bigger, more complex rupture, one that involved a family of 5 gifted brothers, led by a boy named Michael, who would also choose to walk away from Motown for the same familiar reasons: power, money, and freedom. The Jackson 5 awaited in the next chapter. The Jackson 5. Berry Gordy once said that he didn't discover the Jackson 5. They stormed into his life, like an irresistible whirlwind. In 1968, when Gordy watched a performance tape of the 5 Jackson brothers, Jackie Tito, Jermaine Marlin, and the youngest 10-year-old Michael, he immediately knew he was witnessing a phenomenon. Less than a year later, the Jackson 5 officially signed with Motown, and what followed was history. I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, I'll Be There. 4 consecutive #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100, a record-breaking feat for a teen group. Gordy saw them as a new jewel, the hope of rejuvenating Motown just as veteran artists were beginning to leave. He even moved the company's headquarters from Detroit to Los Angeles in 1972, partly to take advantage of the television industry, but mostly to bring Michael and his brothers into Hollywood and expand their influence. But that glittering light soon dimmed under a familiar shadow: contracts and compensation. The Jackson family especially. Their strict father and manager Joe Jackson began asking questions. Why were his sons only receiving 2.9% of the profits from their music, while Motown raked in millions? Endless tours, toy merchandise magazines, TV rights all generated income, yet the amount the group actually saw was minimal. At first, Berry Gordy tried persuasion. He told the press, "Motown is a home, a place where we nurture black dreams." But to the Jacksons, that home was becoming a cage, one that denied them creative control, production rights, and even the ability to be credited as creators of their own music. In 1975, after fruitless negotiations, Joe Jackson secretly struck a deal with CBS Records, specifically its Epic Records label. CBS offered the group full creative freedom, fair profit splits, and most importantly, the right to produce their own music, something Motown had never allowed. When he found out Berry Gordy was furious, he felt betrayed. To him, the Jackson 5 were a golden goose, a youthful emblem he had carefully cultivated. He threatened legal action and declared that if the group left, they would not be allowed to take the name Jackson 5 with them, because legally Motown owned that brand. The Jackson family didn't back down. In June 1975, the group officially left Motown. But one member didn't go: Jermaine Jackson, the group's secondary lead vocalist, and Berry Gordy's son-in-law. Jermaine, caught between his birth family and his wife's, chose to stay with Motown, a decision his younger brothers would see as a betrayal for years to come. From that point on, the Jackson 5 ceased to exist. The group signed a new deal under the name The Jacksons, losing the old brand and all their early hits. Motown kept the rights to everything. The legal battle never reached court, but the emotional scar was permanent. Gordy lost the Jackson 5, but kept the name. The Jacksons, with Michael growing ever more formidable, forged ahead, now writing and producing their own music, stepping into a new era. Many believe that without that departure, there would never have been Thriller, and Michael Jackson might never have become the king of pop. Only after leaving Motown was he free to define himself. From Gordy's perspective, it was a deep wound. He once called Michael the boy I loved most in the music world. But that love wasn't enough to keep a great talent from feeling trapped. This wasn't just a breakup between a group and a label. It reflected a deeper truth about post-civil rights era. American music black artists, after helping build a cultural empire, began demanding control over their own legacies. They no longer wanted to be just the favorites of the label. They wanted ownership. And once that voice became loud enough, not even legendary moguls like Berry Gordy could silence it. He could keep the assets, the name, the copyrights, the contracts, but not the spirit of a generation that had grown up. In that transition, Gordy kept searching for a new force, someone who could symbolize a new age of Motown. But he never expected that this next artist, Rick James, would become the wildest, most untamable storm Motown had ever unleashed. A star impossible to control even as funk's brilliance lit up the twilight of the label. Rick James. Rick James joined Motown in the late 1970s during a precarious period for the label. Its iconic stars were gradually leaving. Classic soul music was losing appeal among younger audiences. And funk, the genre Rick pursued, was still seen as too raw, too primitive to break into the mainstream. But in that very vacuum, Rick James created an explosion. In 1978, his album Come Get. It was released and quickly sold over 2 million copies. Hits like You and I Bustin' Out, and later Super Freak 1981 helped Rick James become a defining funk icon of the decade. With his braided hair, leather outfits, incendiary stage moves, and overtly sexual lyrics, he embodied a persona that stood in stark contrast to Motown's polished old-school image. At first, Berry Gordy kept his distance. He acknowledged Rick's talent, but didn't truly embrace his style. Gordy once told his associates, "That guy is dangerous, but we can't let him fall into someone else's hands." In the early years, he allowed Rick James unprecedented creative freedom, partly because of how unique Rick was, and partly because Motown was lacking a core star. But that freedom soon became an underlying threat to the entire control system that had built the label's success. Rick James was nothing like the classic Motown artists. He wouldn't allow others to write his songs, produce for him, or dictate his image. He wanted full autonomy, and he made it happen. Rick wrote his own music arranged. It directed his stagecraft and press with unpredictable flair. He once told the press, "Motown didn't make me. I made the new Motown." For Berry Gordy, who always put loyalty above all else, this felt like a direct jab at the very model he had spent 2 decades building. The conflict simmered, then became impossible to ignore. By the mid-1980s, Rick James began voicing his discontent publicly. He accused Motown of underinvesting in young black talent while funneling large sums into unprofitable projects. He openly criticized his own label in interviews, demanding total control over his next albums. At the same time, his personal life spiraled: cocaine addiction, extravagant excess, and violent behavior. His 1986 album, The Flag, which Rick hoped would be a political and social milestone, flopped commercially. Motown, already financially strained, lost its patience. Berry Gordy, by then stepping back from day-to-day operations, could no longer reconcile with such an unruly star. The two sides parted ways quietly, but decisively. In 1988, Rick James signed with Warner Brothers, ending nearly a decade of dominance under the Motown banner. His departure didn't resemble that of Marvin Gaye or the Jackson 5. There were no tears, no lawsuits, no graceful farewell. Just a door slammed shut between two forces, too divergent to coexist, one a businessman safeguarding order, the other an artist ruled by instinct and defiance. Berry Gordy rarely spoke of Rick James afterward. Perhaps he knew that in this story, he wasn't the winner. Motown lost a rare source of revenue, while Rick James continued a solitary journey marked by a few brief resurgences, but ultimately consumed by decline, illness, and scandal. But at a deeper level, the relationship between Gordy and Rick James exposed a historic rift between two generations of black artists, one built on patience, discipline, and gratitude to the system, another fueled by individual power, unbounded creativity, and the rejection of all molds. Motown was once a symbol of artist control meant to protect, guide, and succeed. But to Rick James, that was no longer acceptable. He was the harbinger of a new era, an era that wouldn't be shackled by any brand or legacy, not even Motown. And Berry Gordy, standing at the twilight of his career, began to realize a sobering truth. Without sharing power, he would lose the next generation entirely. But perhaps the most painful lesson was still to come. For there was one woman, a founding member of the Supremes, Motown's most successful girl group, who would leave not for money, nor for creative freedom, but out of depression, a fall from the spotlight, and utter loneliness. Florence Ballard, a name Gordy perhaps would never fully forgive himself for. Florence Ballard. Berry Gordy once described Florence as the girl with a voice like red wine, full-bodied, warm, and enveloping. But he also said Diana Ross is the face of Motown, and Motown needs a clear face. That statement, though indirect, revealed the tragedy of Florence. In the game of talent and ambition, the best voice doesn't always get to stay the longest. In the early 1960s, the Supremes were three young girls who grew up in the same Detroit neighborhood: Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard. As the group began achieving success with hits written by Holland-Dozier-Holland like Where Did Our Love Go? And Baby Love, Florence could feel the shift. Diana was increasingly favored, singing more leads, receiving personal makeup attention, always positioned center in photo shoots. Florence, once the core, was slowly being pushed into the background. She didn't hide her sadness. Florence began drinking first to numb the pain, then as a habit. She confronted management about the favoritism, but was met only with dismissive headshakes and sympathetic looks. When Berry Gordy renamed the group Diana Ross and the Supremes in 1967, Florence no longer had doubts she was being removed from the very home she helped build. That June, during a Las Vegas performance, Florence showed up late, drunk, and out of control. Her mic was cut mid-show. Shortly after, Gordy and management decided to replace her with Cindy Birdsong, a member of the Bluebells. The bitterest part, Flo was fired without official notice. No meeting, no thank you, no closure. When asked by the press, Motown claimed she voluntarily stepped down. But the truth was, she was removed from the lineup on her 24th birthday, a small detail that made the emotional wound even deeper. Berry Gordy offered her a solo contract to save face, but Florence, hurt and disillusioned, refused. She left with no money, no lawyer, and no legal standing to reclaim her name or her stake in the group. Motown's contractual clauses barred her from performing old songs or even mentioning the Supremes in her artistic work. What followed was a long downward spiral, a failed contract with ABC Records, and unstable marriage, children born into hardship and worsening depression. In 1976, Florence Ballard died of a heart attack at the age of 32 in a small apartment in Detroit, just blocks from where Motown had once started. At the time of her death, her bank account held less than $1,000. Florence's passing was a harsh wake-up call for Motown, a label once proud of uplifting black artists, yet unable to offer grace when one of them fell. There were no lawsuits, no public accusations, only silence and memory, as Berry Gordy would later say, "I thought I was doing what was right for the group, but I didn't know how much it hurt Flo." This wasn't just one woman's tragedy. It symbolized the darker side of the music industry, where those without ambition, without the savvy to protect themselves, get left behind, even if they were there, laying the foundation stones. Florence Ballard wasn't a star that flared and faded. She was a quiet flame, reminding the world that behind every spotlight stands someone eclipsed. And Motown, in all its greatness, carried shadows like hers, unspoken, unnamed, but eternally haunting. At 95, Berry Gordy looks back on a life full of contradictions between beauty and justice, discipline and compassion, ambition and humanity. And perhaps Florence is the quietest final chapter he never dared to write in words. If these stories have touched something within you, a memory, an emotion, or a new perspective on music history, help us share them with the world. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journeys, where we continue to uncover the lives behind the spotlight, the talents, the sorrows, and the legacies still waiting to be fulfilled.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.